I'm going to start with some basics because, as I said, we have been instructed that it is quite useful to start to keep going over some of these basic items for new staff. The role of EQA or proficiency testing, I'm aware that we have an international audience and both terms are used to apply to the same services, and how that fits in with the general performance management. We all run internal quality control, which looks as, you know, are today's results the same as yesterday's, the same as last week's, the same as the previous batch, however frequently they are run. Whereas external quality assessment or proficiency testing looks at whether your results are the same as other laboratories. External assessment of results from a group of laboratories where each tests the identical specimens of known but undisclosed content within EQA, and we give a long-term retrospective and independent assessment of laboratory performance. And when you're looking at reports, I think that is very important. And of course, it is an essential part of your quality management. Going on from that, EQA measures the standard of results produced by each laboratory and the performance relative to others, be it in the same peer group or across an entire analyte. It allows inter-laboratory comparison of results, gives an indication of how far your result or your bias is from the consensus or the target value. It demonstrates competence to third parties and certainly is required for accreditation. And it allows labs to learn from others and to share best practice. And certainly with many programs, I think that's one of the most important part, because it does put education firmly at the heart of external quality assessment. And it allows a state-of-the-art performance assessment of methods, kits and laboratory practice, which is very useful for oversight groups. There are some restrictions on that because it does require commutable samples if possible, and certainly within haematology that is a challenge. However, it is the goal of all types of EQA. So your report, what should your EQA report provide? Well, this is from the ISO 17043 standard, which is the ISO standard to which EQA providers are accredited. So this is the equivalent of what laboratories have as the ISO 15189. It has many common factors, but is tailored particularly for EQA providers. So clause 7.4.3.1 tells us that proficiency testing reports, and they do use the term PT, shall be clear, accurate, objective and comprehensive, and include data covering the results of all participants together with an indication of the performance of individual participants. They also give us a little bit of a let out about where it's not practical to report all original data. A summary of results, e.g. in tabulated or graphical form, can be supplied, which is a great relief, because I would hate to have to send back to all participants the results of, say, 2,500 instruments in full blood count. It then goes on, and the next clause is all the items that should be in the report, starting from the name and contact details of the proficiency testing provider through to point S, which is comments or recommendations based on the outcomes of the proficiency testing round. There are a lot of points in between, which I won't go into. It does say, however, that you may get this information from other publications provided by the proficiency testing provider. And in particular, for continuous PT schemes, i.e. these are ones that are sent out regularly, it can be sufficient to have simpler reports such that many elements of this subclause can be excluded, but included in the PT scheme procedures. And for us, you will find those in the participants manual or in the instructions that we provide with the programs. So looking at a full blood count report, this is where you would find your information. There is the actual the program that the report is for, your laboratory number, laboratory 20028 is our own UK NEQAS laboratory, the distribution identifier, so this was the full blood count from September of last year, the date it was sent out, the actual individual identifier for the instrument, because obviously many participants may have multiple instruments registered in the program, the summary of the survey contents, and whether you participated or not. So, sorry, I'm just looking at some things that pop up in chat. You will also see that on the front page of the report, you have an overall graphical representation of your performance score. And this runs for the last 10 distributions in full blood count, and it will show it for each individual parameter in the full blood count. Going on to the second page, there is then a page which is dedicated to each of the samples within that particular distribution. And it would tell you at the top there which sample is being referred to. It tells you what's in the performance, how you can find the all methods. The all methods is all the open bars. Your method, where there is a subdivision performance assessment, is in the closed bars. It will also show you, so if I can get rid of this, sorry, I may just need to put back one. That is, so it'll show you all methods there. And it will show you a summary of the performance of the actual sample quality and what you reported. And also you'll see there the overall satisfactory performance. There is then a plot for each individual parameter, and which will give you the distribution for the results for each individual parameter. Sorry, I'm fighting a little bit with the technology here. And within that, it will tell you what your instrument group is, what you were registered in, and it will also show where your result is with the small arrow, which has been highlighted here with a slightly larger arrow. And it will give you an overall summary of your result. So there's your result, the target value, your deviation index, which is the Z-score, how far you were from the target, and certain items such as the statistical items, such as the uncertainty of the target value, the coefficient of variation, the number of participants actually within that instrument group, and the trimmed number, which I will get onto, so the number that were actually used to calculate the target mean, and your performance score, which is shown graphically on the front page of the report. So I did ask the team here if they would look at what the most frequently asked questions about performance that we get in and on our emails on a daily basis. And they tell me that the two most common ones at the time when they took this particular little survey was, how do I calculate my own deviation index, and can I move our instrument to its own specific peer group? I'll deal with the peer group first, and in actual fact, my colleague Yvonne is going to dedicate an entire webinar onto peer group assessment and grouping of instruments, particularly working on from work we've done over the last couple of years with one particular instrument manufacturer. We do, where possible and where it is necessary, group the participants into their own peer group. We don't do every single instrument. We try to group them into a smaller number of peer groups as possible, which gives the best representation statistically. But we do recognise, because of the way in which the material is prepared, that with the use of fixed material, that it will affect how the full blood count material interacts with different instrument manufacturers and instrument reagents. I've just got some photos here of our production of the material for the full blood count program. We prepare approximately 5 litres of material for each batch. We have an automated bottling machine. It is prepared from donated blood components, and of course these come from healthy donors, so we use whole blood, leukodepleted whole blood, Buffy-coat, concentrated red cells, plasma, and platelets. And the components that we use will depend on the targets that are required. Clearly, these are all healthy donors, therefore we don't get people that are walking in with, we don't use donors that have hemoglobin concentrations of 80 what have you. We have to dilute down with plasma, so it is quite a complicated procedure. This takes time. It only takes a day or two, but it certainly takes a lot more time than you would have for analysing a normal full blood count, so the material is stabilised. We then have to pack and ship all the material out to our participant. We prepare up to 1,500 packages at a time, 800 or 900 of those, or are in franked packages, and 400 of them go to overseas. And this whole logistics side of things does take the best part of a week. Therefore, we are not sending out fresh blood, and that is the reason why we have to group participants into peer groups. Coming on then to the deviation index, and I won't try and dwell too much on the statistics here. You can obtain these calculations and details of these calculations from the participants manual. But the deviation index is a Z-score, which basically tells how far the participant's result, which is your result here, is from the target result, which is the mean of the proficiency testing. And it is divided by the standard deviation of here, the PT, the proficiency testing standard deviation. We use it is a robust standard deviation that we use. And in actual fact, for full blood count, we use what is a historical standard deviation. We don't use medians. If we were using medians, we would use the estimated SD. The historical standard deviation is the average standard deviation from the previous 12 specimens, excluding the current specimen, the current survey. And the idea of doing that is it smooths the standard deviation and therefore smooths the impact on the deviation index and the scores. There's a little bit here about interpreting the deviation index, which is taken from the international standards. There, the advice taken from the international standard is that less than 1 is good, because that effectively comes to, less than 1 standard deviation from the mean. Between 1 and 2 is satisfactory, 2 and 3 is borderline, greater than 3, and I stress here, may indicate a problem. With the performance of modern full blood count analyzers, they perform very well. They perform very tightly, and therefore sometimes a deviation, a DI of greater than 3, is something that maybe you should look at, but doesn't necessarily indicate a problem. Target values. So obviously, to calculate a deviation index, you need a target values. The target values, generally in EQA, they may be regulatory, which is that they are set by, they're usually set, if they're regulatory, they're normally set at a fairly low limit. It is a target that everybody should be able to pass. They may be statistical, which is generally what we use. They may be clinical, i.e., have you got the right or the wrong answer? Have you got the right genotype? Have you got the right blood group? And how target values can be derived in external quality assessment is that you can have a known value, you can have a certified reference value as determined by a definitive test or measurement method. You can have a reference value determined by analysis alongside a reference value or standard. You may have the consensus value from a group of experts, or the consensus value derived from analysis of participants' values. This in EQA terms, these are ranked top to bottom. The best target value is one that you actually know the answer to, but usually that comes down to something like a genotype or a blood group. With quantitative values, it is more difficult to actually know the value. In some EQAs, you are able to actually measure in a certain amount of an analyte, but that tends not to happen in haematology. However, we are fairly happy that the consensus value derived from the analysis of participants' value is a fairly robust and reasonable path to take. Main reason for that is that for most of UK NEQAS has a very large participant base, and we are statistically using quite a large number of values. So we use an all methods, well, a methods trimmed mean. It's not the all methods, a methods trimmed mean. And I've popped in here just a slide that shows how one might do that, particularly if you were doing it in Excel. This is how you would calculate the trimmed mean if you were using Excel. Needless to say, we don't do it in Excel because we have umpteen participant groups for a large number of participants in each peer group, and we would be there forever, and it would not be accurate because we would make mistakes. So we do this on the database, but if all else failed, we could do it in Excel. And it generally is the fact that we take all the data, it would then be log transformed to help, because the data can tend to be skewed. We would then calculate the number of samples that would be trimmed out. Now, the trimming is done specifically to remove outliers and to remove those extreme values. They're usually where participants have done something is a bit silly. They might have transposed results, they might have put a decimal place in the wrong wrong position, and the results that they've returned are, or they might have returned in the wrong units, and they will clearly distort the mean value. So they get trimmed, and we statistically we do a 10% trimming, which is 5% from the top and 5% from the bottom. So if we have a scatter of results such as this, which was a batch of 246 in this group, the 5% is 12.3 from the top and 12.3 from the bottom. Clearly you can't trim 0.3 of a result, so it then gets rounded, and in actual fact was rounded in this case to 13. So you take out a whole number of results. You then know what you've got left. You rank it all. Well, you rank it before you start in actual fact, and you then know how many you've got left. We then have to apply something called a BAF, or a bias adjustment factor, which, and I can almost hear everybody's eyes glazing over at this point, which is something that adjusts for the amount that's been trimmed out. We then calculate the trimmed mean, reverse the logs, calculate standard deviation, and what is a CV, or a geometric CV. So it is possible for people to calculate their own trimmed mean, but you do need the raw data, and you need quite a lot of patience. Needless to say, we don't do it that way. We have a database that does it for us, although the method is the same. We also have here a calculation of how we would calculate the historic standard deviation, which is used to calculate a deviation index. And as I've said here, the HSD is calculated from the average RSD for most recent 12 samples, excluding those in the current survey. And there's the statistical formula. And the idea of that is just to smooth the SD and the impact that it will have on the deviation index. So the answer to can I calculate my own SD is yes, you can. You can probably calculate it from some of the data that is produced in the report. However, you will probably not get quite the same answer, and that is one of the biggest problems we have. Often participants come back to us and say, I've calculated this, I don't get the same answer as you do. As long as it is close enough, you know, I'm generally fairly happy. If it's way out, I might go back and look at our data. But you need to remember we calculate to far more numbers of decimal places than you may expect, or we show in the reports. And it is quite a complex and statistically validated process. We then use the DI, and again, you can get this from the participants manual, to calculate the analytical performance score. Is taken from the most recent 6 specimens, including the current survey. So we would take, for example, the most recent 6 specimens for which data has been returned. We remove the arithmetical sign, we sum the DI, and we apply a multiplication factor. For most of our programs, although not all, this multiplication factor is 6. And that multiplication factor helps grade everything, or applies a sensitivity factor to the scores, so that a score of above 100 is indicative of a problem perhaps in the assay. And again, score of 80 to 100, maybe borderline greater than 100, is unsatisfactory. We're often asked by participants about avoiding unfair penalties. And of course, a result may attract a very high DI because of a blunder result, for example, a transposition. If somebody has put in, you know, transposed white count hemoglobin or something like that. We adjust the algorithm for the calculation of the score to try and avoid that immediately putting somebody into a situation of being an unsatisfactory performer. And we deal with that by truncating all the DI values to a maximum of 3.5 before calculating the performance score, to avoid giving anybody an unfair penalty. And I will also say here that the multiplication factor, it is 6 for full blood count, it's 6 for all of our automated programs. However, it does vary according to the program and the analyte to make the scores comparable. So for example, for the hemoglobin A2, the multiplication factor is 9, because that scaled it so that we actually are picking up the people who are making clinically significant errors. So what does satisfactory look like? Well, in the full blood count, I've got a plot here of a hemoglobin with a very good score. The actual score here is nice and even, which is obviously also what good looks like, and it is around about 25, which is absolutely excellent. In order to push yourself above the action line of 100, you would need an average score of 2.77 over 6 specimens if you go back through, if you work your way back through the calculation of the score. An average score of 2.22 over 6 specimens will push you into the unsatisfactory zone or the borderline zone. An average score of 1.94, so just below a DI of 2, will keep you well in the satisfactory zone. And this is an average score, remember, it's not just the occasional high DI. An occasional high DI will not push you into unsatisfactory performance. An average DI of 1 will keep your score below 36, and an average DI of 0.69 will keep your score at 25. So it's important to remember those figures. You really do have to have an average score of above 3 for quite a number of samples to actually score above 100. However, so you get a report like this, and this is a selection of reports that would be sort of a matter of some concern. We've got a report here with the trending in WBC and up and into the unsatisfactory performance zone. We've got a plot here for an individual sample where there's deviation index of above 3, and here is the participants' result, where you can see they are outside their own peer group. This would have been their peer group. They are outside that peer group. We've got another item here, which is always worth looking at. We've got a plot here of several parameters which are all trending out, and this can happen, especially for calculated parameters where they are all interlinked. Sometimes one will go out before the other. However, it's important to look at these when you are trying to understand what might be causing, and look at what is actually probably the measured parameter rather than the calculated ones to start with. And I would suggest here that given that red blood count is usually a very stable parameter, that the key here to look at is probably what is wrong with the red blood count. That may well be affecting, and there's a little bit of problem here, slight trending here on the mean cell volume. These will affect the packed cell volume. Of course, these will then have their own knock-on effects into things like the mean cell hemoglobin concentration and the mean cell hemoglobin. So it's always worth looking at them all and trying to pick out which one you think is the one that is causing a problem on your analyzer. So going back to the individual high DI, so your report looks like this. You've got a DI 3.73, which, going by the ISO standard, is something that you should look at, may indicate a problem. And here is the participants' results. Now, the first thing we always say to all participants is, please, first of all, there's two things you need to ask about. First of all, was the specimen okay? We are happy that we send out good quality specimens. However, we have no control over what happens to them in between the actual our sending and leaving our door and arriving on your bench. So, is one specimen affected, or are both specimens affected? If both specimens affected, your package might have been exposed to an excessive amount of heat or vibration or some problems. If you have one analyzer, are they all affected? It's very unlikely that they're all going to be out of sync or out of calibration all at the same time, unless of course that may be associated with a lot change, which is always worth bearing in mind. So do bear in mind that if all your analyzers are affected, it might be the specimen. And which analyzers are affected? We tend to find that certainly for red blood count, the red blood count is very stable. However, platelets and white counts are less so. It's the same with our fixed samples as it is with the with your own fresh samples. They may be the ones that are affected. So if it is a very hot time of year, if you think the specimen has been affected by heat and the platelet count is out, it may be a problem with specimen quality. Not always, however. You need to exclude blunders in your own laboratory. And the typical ones is, have you tested the correct specimens? You will be surprised how many participants test the last month's distributions. So have you tested the correct specimens? Have you transposed the specimens or the results at data entry? Have you changed your instrument, not updated your records, which can cause problems? Have you handled the specimens according to what we put in the instructions? This is particularly important for some of the fully fixed samples, such as the ADLC. They have to be handled. They should not be put on an automated mixer, for example. The handling instructions and the mixing instructions are quite clear. Have you put the specimens in the correct mode? As analyzers become more complex and we are sometimes using more fully fixed or commercial material, it has to go through in a particular mode, maybe a QC mode, and sometimes even a particular QC mode. Have you reported the results in the correct units? Fairly obvious. Have you entered the results correctly? You've not made any data entry errors. And have you checked specimen instructions? And were the specimen instructions correct? We might have made a blunder with that. And I've generally checked here an avoiding random errors checklist. So are the specimens in date and in good condition? Have you checked the right ones? Did you store them correctly after receipt? Did you mix, reconstitute, handle them correctly prior to analysis? And I have seen that happen sometimes on participants when they're on different sites. They've been doing it correctly in one site and not in another. And have you tested in the correct mode? And should you, if you've excluded all those things, should you request repeat ones? Again, for a high DI value, look at the analytical blunders, exclude specimen quality concerned, particularly check the analyte concentration. A frequent problem, especially with platelets, if we have a low platelet concentration, it becomes far harder rather to get within the good deviation index. Main reason for that is a platelet count. So if we send a platelet count of 15, plus minus 2 or 3 on that is clinically not a great problem. However, it will make a statistical problem, and you need to look at that and observe whether that has happened on whether you see the same problems on both specimens. We never send, or rarely would ever send, 2 very low platelets in the same distribution. So check the other specimen as well, and just ask yourself, is the variation of clinical significance? If it isn't, then just continue to monitor. Also, are there any large changes in the DI or the bias? Could you have a random analytical error, or are there any trends? So just look at all those items. Systematic errors you need, again, I keep coming back to this, exclude the blunders, take an action summary to review your IQC and your patient's data for trends, consider whether you do need any PM or recalibration, review if there's any changes that could have impacted upon the data, and consider about whether you need to run comparisons with other instruments or sites. And above all, review your deviation index for any bias patterns. If there is a persistent bias or a marked change in bias, a bit like looking at Westgard rules, there's an increase or decrease in bias, you may have a systematic error. Now, there is always the query that, it's not our instrument, it's down to the sample you've sent us. We do try very hard to look at the stats on the samples as they come out, and we do review all the stats before we release the reports, and that is sometimes why there is a delay in reports. And on occasion, we may withdraw the specimens from analysis or scoring because of a problem with the survey material, which we've detected after distribution. The CV percent might be too great, and there may be changes in numbers of instruments that cause a problem, and we feel that the data is not sufficiently robust. There may occasionally, very occasionally, be a problem for a specific group of participants, which may be a new analyzer that's come onto the market. It may be that there's been a hold up in delivery particular regions. The uncertainty of the target value for the CV, for the EQA, might be too great, or if it's qualitative results, there may be a lack of consensus, which means that although we knew what the sample was, there's something that's happened to it, and there is a lack of qualitative results, qualitative consensus. And the sort of review that we would do is, if I look here, this is a plot of the CVs. This actually is for platelet count, and I've cut the top off in doing my screenshot. This is a platelet count for Sysmex XN analyzers over the last 2 years. This is the UK NEQAS CV. You can see that there is a variation in CV. For the platelet count, it usually runs at around about 5% or below, which is quite acceptable. There are the occasional high ones, and these in particular will correlate with generally with the low platelet counts that we have sent out. However, if we would see a particular high CV and we can't explain it in-house, or we saw a particularly high CV across a number of parameters, we would look into that, and that is when we may withdraw the samples. We also will look to see whether there are any particular data points that need to be excluded, because although we trim our 10%, that may not be sufficient on occasion, and there may be a couple of participants who have not been trimmed out by that 10% trimming. We will go back, we will look, and we will trim more data out. not to just get the answer that we want. It sounds a bit like fudging the factors, but you can generally eyeball the data. And Yvonne and I do almost every single survey that goes out. I always dread the point when she says, can you just look at this data with me? And I think my heart sinks. I think, oh no, I just don't want to. But we do eyeball the data, and we can spot then if there are blunders that have not been trimmed, and we do need to take those out, and we will then rerun the stats, rerun the CVs. That does take time, and that sometimes is why your reports don't come out within 2 days, which is what we aim for the full blood count. Sometimes we do have to do a little bit more delving into the data to make sure that the report is adequate. The one thing that you should look at and you should be aware of within your when you're looking at your report is, have you made a critical error? Regardless of what the score might be, a critical error is often one that will have a high DI, even if your score is good. So you do need to actually look at those, and which is why I would advocate people actually looking at DIs that are greater than 3. So critical error is one that has the potential to change a patient's pathway, regardless of the effect of the ultimate diagnosis arrived at, and which might deny that person the earliest opportunity of correct treatment. Now, obviously, there are no patients at the end of the EQA sample, but you should take the EQA sample as a free lesson. It's a free lesson to get something wrong. I know that you will have to account for any wrong results with when you come through to UCAS assessment, but it is better to have made it with an EQA sample than with a patient sample. So the examples are things like critical answers will be things like total WBC counting for patients on particular drugs. For example, the antipsychotic clozapine. They have very, very strict cutoffs for the WBC and the neutrophil count, which will deny the patient the medication that they need. And given that this is often a drug of last resort for these patients, this is a very serious item. This is a very serious action to have to take on the basis of the WBC count. If you get the increase, on a qualitative test, if you get the incorrect mutation analysis in molecular diagnostics or blood group or something like that, obviously that is a critical error, because that potentially could affect that patient's choices. For example, their reproductive choices. It could mean that they get the wrong blood or the group of blood of the wrong group. It could have an enormous impact upon them. And I will also add into that, because as you've probably heard in the introduction, I've spent a lot of my time looking at inherited disorders of red cells, such as hemoglobinopathies. If you report an incorrect hemoglobin A2 in antenatal screening, there's 2 things that can happen. One is that you might miss a beta thalassemia carrier and therefore miss the opportunity to request testing for a baby's biological father. You can also, perhaps, if it's preconceptual screening, it may affect somebody's life choices, their choice of partner, and how they go on in their relationships. So it is very serious. All of these things are critical. They'd be critical, absolutely critical, if they're patient samples. The EQA gives you the opportunity of a free lesson in that. And I've got just a couple here of plots from the abnormal hemoglobins program. They're both on hemoglobin A2. This first one is a participant who's had an upwards trend. They haven't made any critical errors, actually. A little bit of a negative bias. The mean on this particular sample, for example, was around about 2.7. They were producing a result of just about 2.4. I would say if I was running a laboratory, I would want it to be better than that. I want it to be closer to the target, but it's not an absolute critical error. It hasn't misdiagnosed, for example, a beta thalassemia patient, beta thalassemia carrier patient, as normal. However, they have shown a persistent bias, and that has been reflected in the trending upwards. In actual fact, this particular participant, we started discussing with them around about here. In actual fact, what they have done is that they've done the usual things. It was an HPLC user. They've done the usual, the appropriate corrective action. They have changed the column, had some PMI, looked at the general calibration, and we anticipate that their score will then come down. One thing I would say about a high score is, once you've taken corrective action, it takes a bit of time for it to come back into the acceptable zone. and you shouldn't panic over that. As long as it is still coming down and the deviation index values are within the satisfactory zone, then don't take any further action, because the risk you run then is that you then overcorrect and you then overshoot and you get your bias going in the opposite direction. So just be aware that once you've taken corrective action, there is a lag between this when this score comes down. That's simply because the score is calculated over the last 6 specimens for which you returned results, which is the last three distributions generally. That does mean that if you've got a high DI in one of the last 3 distributions, you'll have to wait for that to effectively fall off the calculation before your DI comes down entirely. So as long as before your score comes down entirely. So as long as the DIs are satisfactory and the score is falling, don't take any further action. And I think that is quite important. The next item next case that I did pull out was one where slight upward trend. They've gone up into the borderline zone, however, not past the point at which it would trigger a letter from the program. However, what they have done here on what was a normal specimen with an average hemoglobin A2, a trimmed target hemoglobin A2 of around about 2.6, they've reported a result of 4.4. Now that would mean that were this a patient sample, that this normal result would have been probably reported as a beta thalassemia carrier. Probably slightly, fail safe if you like, because it would have, if it was a patient sample, then it would have prompted the call-in of the baby's biological father for testing. However, that does cause a lot of anxiety for, in pregnancy, to call somebody in unnecessarily. However, if you look at the results, we've also got a DI value here of 8.28, which is enormous and really, really high. In actual fact, there was nothing wrong with their machine. This was actually a simple data entry error. What the participant had done in this case is that they had, at data entry, they had transposed the hemoglobin A2 result and the hemoglobin F results, and we sorted that with them. However, on the other hand, as healthcare scientists, we should be checking our data and making sure we are putting it in the right way around. But however, this was not something that would have caused a problem had it been a patient's result, because they would not be manually data entering. However, this is where it is worth looking at the high DI value and then delving in and looking at what's caused that, which is to actually explain that there is nothing wrong with the particular assay. And ultimately, I will also say, and this is almost the last slide, you always need to ask, once you've gone through all these things, you always need to be aware and always ask that, could there be a real problem? And we do, from time to time, pick up things that have only been picked up through the EQA. And it is always need to bear in mind that we do try our absolute best to make sure that the results that are sent out to you are reflective. Doing proficiency testing or EQA is not just a tick box exercise. We are trying to work in partnership with participants in order to improve and maintain the quality of the patient's results. So do go back and ask whether your IQC results are satisfactory, and really satisfactory. They're not just borderline. Is all your instrument maintenance up to date? Has there been a change in personnel, maintenance, reagents, calibration, etc., lot changes which might correlate with a change in performance? And we have seen that on occasion. Have you made a calculation error? I mean, one of the biggest errors that we did pick up with a participant once, where they were making a calculation error. They've made it for some time, and they had reported, this was for G6PD assay, they had reported the incorrect values on around about 60 patients' results, and it was very useful for them to be able to go back and trace those patients. So, then ask yourself, could the patient's results have been affected by the changes that you've seen in the EQA, and has there been a critical error?
Thanks everyone for your attention, and thank you, Barbara, for that really interesting and informative talk. It's always been something that I struggled with when I was in the lab on interpreting my my reports, because there's just so much data on these reports that you can use, but it's knowing what to look at and when to worry. So our first question is from Chris Hooper. In calculating the DI, why use the SDPT rather than the SD for specific instrument group?
Right. We probably are using it is actually the SD for the specific instrument group, because it is the SD for the PT is just that we're using the SD that's come. It comes out of ISO 13528. That in the terminology is the SD for PT, but it is actually SD for the instrument group. But it is the historical standard deviation, so that we can smooth the smooth the impact of changes in SD, which are related to the analyte concentration, and to avoid, so we can avoid, spikes and jumps in the scores, which might alarm participants. So it's to allow us to give that more long-term retrospective assessment. But it is actually the SDPT is actually the SD for the specific instrument group, and it's calculated for each instrument group. Chris, I hope that is clear.
Great. Our next question is from an anonymous attendee. How is the uncertainty of target value calculated?
Well, I've actually got the stats analysis SOP open in front of me, because I knew somebody would ask me quite difficult questions. The SD for the PT, it is the uncertainty. It is one, and this again comes from ISO 13528. It is and probably dealt with by cleverer statisticians than I am. It is the standard deviation over the number of over the square root of the number of results times 1.25. Now that is just how it is calculated. What is perhaps more important is where it's regarded as significant or not. And certainly from ISO 13528, we look at it, and how we assess it is if the uncertainty of the assigned value, i.e. the target value, is negligible, it need not be included in the interpretation of the results of the proficiency test. And how we deal with that, it is actually, if the uncertainty of the proficiency testing target is less than 0.3 of the standard deviation of the proficiency test, then it is regarded as negligible, and we don't have to make any account when we are assessing the target value and how we interpret the actual results. So it is, as I say, it is all set down in the ISO standard if you want bedtime reading. But it is actually, it allows us to assess whether we need to take it into account when we are assessing or performance managing the participants. But it is another statistical calculation.
Then our next question is from Nogopi Nsabane. When we have a NEQAS non-conformance, we do an extent and impact assessment and always struggle with, do we reassess patient results? What do other labs do? And what is the recommendation or suggestion?
Yes, yeah, it's quite an important question. I would say that there are certain situations where you probably should, it is advised that you should do a look back on patient results, and they particularly are those where they have diagnostic significance. And I would say then things like hemoglobin A2, or if you're doing molecular testing or something like that, I would suggest that it is difficult to know what you do with something like full blood count. And I think then it would have to be, if you consider that you're, you may have a bias of, whatever the bias might be, will that have impacted on any particular patients? It might depend on the type of patients you're looking at. I would suggest for full blood count, it is rare that the trending in full blood count, unless there's something really, really way out, like you've got a bias, or there's a problem with your hemoglobin where you're 10 or 20 grams per litre away from the target, which clearly could have had an impact on patients. We rarely see that, certainly not in mainline laboratory analyzers. Very occasionally we see it in point of care testing, although that often, the impact there is often then on, is due to handling of the samples, and handling, and rather than the actual instrument. So I think it depends on what the root cause is, coming down to some of those situations. If you have, you know, a POCT tester who clearly is not running samples correctly, then you may have a longer a longer term or a bigger impact, because you may then want to go back and look at some of the tests that have gone through. But it will come down to things like whether you've made that critical error, I think.
Great. Really great question. Next one is from Anonymous. Why is the AH program not performance assessed by instrument group?
That's also an interesting one. It's largely because we do consider that the material is commutable, therefore it should all be getting the same answer. Now, clearly there is a difference. Hemoglobin A2 in particular, if you look at, there is a wider variation in results between, say, HPLC analyzers than there is between capillary electrophoresis analyzers. That can then mean that we're setting the bar almost too high for particular instrument groups. And we did once have a participant whereby they had both a capillary electrophoresis and HPLC analyzers in the same laboratory, and they said we've got the same, we've actually submitted the same value, you know, target value of around about 2.6. We've submitted 2.7. We've got an acceptable DI for our HPLC analyzers and an unacceptable one for our capillary electrophoresis, because the performance of capillary electrophoresis machines is so much tighter, certainly at that time. And that causes problems, because it's not giving them a level playing field. We consider that the material is commutable, therefore we will do the actual overall performance assessment across all methods. However, we will report, so that you can look at the individual method, where there are sufficient instruments registered for that particular instrument group. We will provide you sub-method stats, and there are sub-method stats both for HPLC and capillary electrophoresis. There are then, where there are sufficient HPLC analyzers registered, or sufficient any model of analyzer registered, we will then provide you with those actual method group or those sub-method group stats. We do generally only supply sub-method group stats where we've had more than about 20, and it does vary slightly, but where there's more than about 20 results entered, so that we actually can supply you with some robust and reasonable statistics. So but the main reason for doing the AH is all the same. It's twofold. One is the material, we consider it to be commutable. The other thing is that when you look at the algorithms from the national, the UK sort of, or the NHS England national screening programme for hemoglobinopathy and thalassemia screening, there is only one cutoff. It does not give you cutoffs by instrument, and we feel it's very important that we can reflect back to participants the limitations, and I will probably have this carved on my gravestone, the limitations of the methodology that you are using. And I think ultimately that is what we're trying to convey to you. So you need to know whether your method is slightly biased above or below what is a national cutoff, and you need to be able to adjust your laboratory practice for that. And understand the limitations when you're working around that borderline level. As I say, I think I will have written on my gravestone, she didn't understand the limitations of the methodology she was using. But it's you know, I think that is why it's so that we can give you a proper illustration and a proper representation of the acceptability of the data you're producing, rather than just something that is a tick box exercise that reassures you that your machine is the same as everybody else in that group, and which means and that often can mean you are just as good or as bad as everybody else that is in that group. In an ideal world, I would like to be able to put even all of the full blood count materials, all the results, into a single instrument group. It would be possible, certainly for many of the parameters, and certainly for things like hemoglobin, red count, and most of the red cell parameters, because we see CVs on the hemoglobin of less than 2%, that, which to my mind, even on our fixed material, means that those instruments are all getting the same answer. However, people want to see a much tighter performance on their results, and I know certainly the instrument manufacturers and many participants would complain ad infinitum to me. I think we could probably even get away with platelets and white count for many items and still produce clinically correct results. And one day when I've got enough time, I might actually do that exercise and see what people say about it. But obviously with the full blood count material, it is fixed material, and therefore it has to be assumed that it is not commutable.
Right, that was a brilliant question. Thank you for that. We've got 5 minutes left and 2 questions. Oh, 3.
Okay.
Next one's from Simon Wallace. How do you decide on instrument groupings for instruments from the same manufacturer? Is it after looking at data from participant results, so there is a lag between new instrument users being put in their own group?
Yes, I mean, and Yvonne's going to spend an entire hour on this later in the year. Yes, it is, Simon. We work in several ways. Where we can, we try and work with the manufacturers before their instruments are even released certainly onto the UK market. If we can get them to test our material beforehand, we do, so that we can see how it is running with their other instruments. We rely firstly on advice from them because they understand where there's similarities or differences in their technologies. And for example, if they've got a rebadged instrument, so although it says Beckman on the outside, it's actually been made by another manufacturer and they've rebadged it, then we often need to know that so that we can actually group it correctly. And that does cause some rather odd looking groupings, but we are doing it so that we can get the same technologies together. So the initial thing is to rely on advice from the manufacturers, and we meet with them certainly at least once a year to discuss these items. After that, it is often more empirical. After that, we observe the data from new groups and new instruments, and then see whether the grouping needs adjustment. And that is why sometimes you will see we've done a lot with, say, for example, the Hariba instruments over the last year or so. You will see how we have then shifted the instrument grouping because we've accumulated sufficient data. Sorry, I now need to do something weird, which is to wave at the wave at the automatic lights because they've considered I've sat still for too long and I'm obviously dead. It is a combination of both. We rely on advice on the technology, and then we look at the data from participant results, and there may be a lag between a new instrument coming on the market and seeing how the data settles down.
Okay, let's see if we can squeeze in Jacqueline's question. Sometimes we need to reanalyze some of the EQC samples submitted. However, we notice quite a fluctuation between the first result and the second. Does anyone else experience the same issue, please?
I don't know whether anyone else experiences the same issue because it's only me answering. You may well see a fluctuation. I would say there that we do two things. We do two things before we send our material out. First of all, we do homogeneity testing, which means if we bottle 1,500 samples, for example, we take at least 10 or 20 scattered across that batch. We analyze them. We analyze them on the prep day, we analyze them ideally on dispatch day and on closing day to make sure that the samples firstly are homogeneous, so there is homogeneity across the group. And that then there is stability on the within each sample, we have to randomize the samples. We randomize them, test them, randomize them again using a white noise randomizer, and test them a second time and do calculations on that. So we are happy that there should not be fluctuations. I would then also say that there'll be sufficiently similar results. I would then say sometimes we normally ask people not to test the samples more than once. Do understand that might be necessary. I would also then say sometimes, how do you know what the fluctuation is on your patient samples? Do you regularly test those twice? I would also then say that quite often the fluctuations you may see may exist, but they may not actually affect your score because the overall performance will still be satisfactory.